I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. I've been following Benjamin Vogt on Twitter for years now, and I've always admired his unapologetic stance on wild gardens and native plants. And it's been a pleasure to follow his journey as a garden designer and monarch butterfly champion extraordinaire. I was really excited to see he'd released a book about gardening in a time of climate change and mass extinction. And when I read it, I realised what an important thought leader he is on the international stage of garden design and landscape architecture. I believe this book will be looked back upon as one that ushered in, or rather kicked down the door and barged through, a new garden ethic. That's the title of Benjamin's book, and I asked him what that means to him in theory and in practice.
A new garden ethic at its core is just, it's about reconciliation ecology, which is, so in urban landscapes where we dwell the most, there's less wildlife, there's just less nature in general. So in urban landscapes, how can we recreate wildness and bring wildlife back home to interact with us in our daily lives so that we're all getting to know one another again and learning how to work with one another again. So we're reconciling ourselves with the world that we've had domination over and learning to be more in the web and not just being on top in this false hierarchy. So the whole garden ethic is just learning to garden not just for ourselves, but at least equally for other species.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting in the book, actually, the idea of gardens as, well, not just gardens, the whole entire planet as a community, and communities that are specific to, say, where you live. So your community might consist of a certain amount of species and they would be specific to that area, and by being there, you're part of it. So it's considering other life as well as our own and not separating ourselves from it. So, how important is it that we do feel connected to our surroundings and actually feel that we're invested in that part of the community?
Oh God, there's just so many directions we could take this conversation, and so many studies from different fields we could cite. Just thinking about how when you're involved in a community in general and invested in a community, even if you're just thinking human community, you're so much healthier and happier and all those related issues. But then when you think about community as other species, I think a lot of us don't think that way, that there is community with other species, and there are species who speak languages that we maybe once did understand or could understand again, and all the wonderful, powerful things that would do for us emotionally and psychologically and physically. There's so many studies out there, for example, that say students with who are in the classroom learning their math and all that good stuff, when they have a view of complex nature outside the classroom, they're able to learn better, be more creative, able to work in groups better. They'll have less ADD issues, less depression. So we really do need nature. So it's really ironic that at least over by me, we have so much lawn and so much wood mulch and so little trees and flowers.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, yes, there are lots of studies that show different effects on people on so many levels, as you say. So if we did, this was something that struck me as I was reading your book, and it's a little bit off topic, but it kind of struck me that the more we become disconnected from our landscapes and our wild areas, it's actually a little bit easier for us to bulldoze through things, whether that is something that kind of makes us feel better as humans on a conscious level, or whether it's actually driven by the kind of need to want to bulldoze things from a commercial point of view. Do you think that there is an agenda there, or has that just kind of, because we're disconnected, it's easier for us to just plow through stuff, rip it up? Is that just a coincidence, that's something that's evolved?
I think it's both. I mean, obviously, as a species, we convert and change the environment to suit our needs and wants. But then when you toss in something like capitalism and think, we have we have giant corporations lobbying elected officials to do this to favor them, do that to favor them. Like I grew up in Minnesota, and in the northern part of that state, it's very woodsy, very wild, lots of lakes and rivers, and just very natural. But now there's a corporation that's going to start mining in a very fragile natural area, and simply because they lobbied the current administration to let them go in and mine and basically do whatever they want. It's definitely both, right? I mean, we have all these concerns that are fighting in our heads. I need to make money, I need to support my family, I need to support my shareholders. Oh, it's just a mess. Whenever you marginalize someone else, and that can be a human being, or that can be a place, or that can be another species. Whenever you marginalize them and say, "Oh, they're not as good as me," or their concerns aren't as valid or equal to mine, then that gives us in a lot of ways a sense of ownership, or a sense to do what we want with them or what we want against them, because we're sort of validating ourselves. So when you say, this prairie over here, it's not bringing me any income, so I need to switch it over to soybeans or a cornfield or something. Or when we are not intimate with the species that are around us, and we don't know them, we don't know their life cycles, we don't know their language, we don't know their families even,
Mm.
then yeah, we don't care as much. So we're going to do what we want with them, because we consider them not as valid as us, not as valid as our concerns.
And I think that comes from a lack of understanding, because another thing that you speak about in the book is the fact that we just don't have a clue really about what's going on. We've only touched the tip of the iceberg in terms of relationships between species and how they coexist, in a beneficial way. That's an issue, isn't it? We don't have a very good understanding yet, although we think we're leaps and bounds ahead of anything that's gone before. We still don't really understand what's going on in the soil with microorganisms, relationships between species that are codependent, and the kind of the food cycles of certain animals. We just don't have a clue, have we? We've not done the research yet.
Well, it's just ridiculously overwhelming. You'd have to spend 5 gazillion zillion dollars, on the
Mm.
research to understand this stuff, and then you still probably would only know 10% of it. So I mean, why don't we just trust nature? It seems to have done a pretty good job. It got us here, got us this far. So yeah, we don't know. I mean, even just thinking about native bees, honeybees are the one bee species that seem to be studied above all else. Maybe bumblebees after that, but we have what, thousands and thousands of bee species around the world, and we practically know nothing about them, what they need. So how can we possibly know how to fight for what they need and what they want in a landscape? How can we fight for equality for them when we don't know? But maybe we don't have to know. Maybe it's just simple. You know what? You exist, I exist, we need to exist together. And it's just as simple as having that sort of level of empathy and compassion.
Yeah, because I guess that until we do understand, if we ever did, might be too late anyway. So, as humans, I think there's a need to try and ignore or pretend things aren't happening if we can't understand them. So, I think maybe the problems stem from that a lot of the time.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you look at things too deeply, or when they make you uncomfortable about some aspect of yourself, yeah, we don't want to look at it. We we don't want to admit that we're causing a mass extinction on climate change. That hurts.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, you can see why people fight it. So a lot of your work, particularly in your garden where you live at the moment, is based around planting native plants. And as I said to you in the preamble to this interview, I've come up against resistance to using native plants in design, and indeed the entire concept of native plants. So. One of the things that gets brought up a lot is, how far do we go back when we consider what is a native plant? So, what do you think? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I've had people in the past argue, well, ginkgo trees used to be native to North America, so millions of years ago.
Mm.
So why is it okay to plant them? Well, because nothing can use them right now. I just go with the definition of pre-European settlement. Lots of people have different timelines and different places to go back into, but that's what I go with. Until Europeans came in and just really supercharged the changes in the landscape, especially out here in the middle of the United States, where it's just, it used to be all prairie, and now it's almost all 100% monoculture grain crops. So, but the species that depended, the bees and the birds, those species that depended on native plants and native plant communities, they're still here. They're still hanging on. So why wouldn't you plant the things that they need? Why wouldn't you try and connect habitats with a native plant garden outside your back door? It just doesn't make any sense to me that you wouldn't try and do that.
No. I think a lot of people, would also think that perhaps if you do try and recreate nature, what you're doing is almost creating a pastiche of nature. How do you kind of address that objection?
Well, I mean, that's the definition of a garden, isn't it? I mean, can a garden ever be natural? And I don't think it can be. I'm never going to argue that even if you plant 100% native plants, it's going to be nothing more than an echo of what was here before. But at least you're using the pieces of that echo, right? And you're seeing the species come to use those pieces of that echo. So, I mean, the entire world is now a garden, right? We've changed everything. Every last square inch is affected at least by carbon dioxide or something. So how are we gonna garden then? How are we gonna garden this world so that we make sure we leave as many pieces as we possibly can? Because that's what the famed ecologist and environmentalist Aldo Leopold said. The first trick to intelligent tinkering is to leave as many pieces as you possibly can. You're certainly not leaving the pieces if you're coming in and planting as many non-native exotic plants as you possibly can, because you think they're pretty and you think they're pretty in this specific arrangement.
Mm-hmm. So are you entirely against using anything that doesn't come from isn't native in your terms?
Oh, most of the time I am. So, I mean, sometimes I am just to rile people up and start a debate. And then, but I mean, there are always caveats. There are always rules to be bent and to be broken. I certainly think that when it comes to street trees, I think there are plenty of good native street trees that we can use. We don't always have to use exotic species. But when I'm designing gardens, I'm trying to use 100% native species, and I get pretty close. Sometimes it's maybe 95%, but it's usually 100. I'm trying to use straight species, so I'm definitely not using cultivars. And if I am using a cultivar, I'm making sure. I don't know. I'm still on the fence about cultivars. I sometimes think, if it was found in the wild, then maybe nature intended it to grow. But then what happens is we just go and we mass produce this plant, and it's literally the same plant genetically all over the world. So that's not good.
No, and actually, when I was trying to source some plants recently, I spoke to a big nursery in this country, and they said, oh, well, you'll be very pleased to know that we are kind of making strides into providing native plants, and it's on our agenda for next year because the momentum's gathering over here in the UK, I think, and more people are demanding native plants. But as you say, if that happens, then I'm guessing what happens is they grow native plants in pots using peat, compost, probably drenching them in pesticides, and then they send them out to market, and they are all genetically, more or less the same, and they're probably in some instances a slightly improved version. So whether that's a dwarfer variety because it doesn't flop over, or so there is the worry for me that even with the native planting movement, it can be commercialized to a certain extent. And actually what you're saying is maybe have a bit of patience and try and grow things that are from your area. I think that's the important thing, isn't it? To kind of, again, go back to that idea of the community, is to kind of keep material, allow it to be open pollinated, but try and source stuff that would naturally be found in your garden. I mean, obviously you're in Nebraska, you're not trying to grow something that comes from the desert in California, because although it's native, it's not native to your area. So I think
Right.
probably that's a
Exactly.
message to remember. It does seem as if we're on a really fast learning curve regarding the environment and specifically our gardens. And apart from people having a resistance to native plants because from a commercial aspect or for any other reason, I think you kind of state in your book that you did make mistakes when you started gardening. And I know I have. I haven't always gardened in the way that I do now in such a kind of gentle way. So do you think sometimes when people read books, not so much like yours, but when people read books where, where they're being told, or you should do this for the environment or you shouldn't do this, do you think sometimes they feel as if they're a little bit being attacked?
Of of course, but it's not the author doing the attacking. Um, it's their response to what the author is saying. It's like for many years I've had people say, "Stop making me feel guilty when you talk about native plants." And I'm not saying, "Hey, John, I went to your house and I looked at your landscape and oh my God, X, Y, Z." Right? I'm not. How can I possibly know? People are feeling guilty not because of something I said, but because they realize that this is making me think in uncomfortable ways and making me think more critically and deeply and all these kind of massive complex ways about how I view a garden, how I view a landscape, and how I view myself interacting with that landscape. So they're having to process all these new radical ideas that basically test who they think they are. And that's psychology 101. They're being confronted with having to think about themselves in entirely new ways and think about how they interact with the environment in new ways. And it's hard because our brains are not hardwired to easily go in these new directions and to challenge who we think we are, what our self-concept is of ourselves.
I mean, even the most sensitive of us and the most intelligent and compassionate are, we're a little bit digging in our heels and we're not making the changes quickly enough. I mean, why are we throwing up so many barriers, particularly as gardeners? Why are we fighting this?
No, that's a really good question. I mean, why are nurseries fighting it? Why are landscape architects fighting it? I had a big landscape architect tell me recently that they they design gardens for people. And I'm like, great, wonderful. That's exactly what a garden is. That's what the tradition of gardening is. But in a time of mass extinction, that can't be all that it is. It needs to be at least 50-50 gardening for people and wildlife. And just because you're gardening for other species and using native plants doesn't mean you stop gardening for yourself. It's not like you have a piece of pie and suddenly you're getting less of the pie. It's just that everybody's getting some of the pie.
Mm.
So it, it's there are a lot of, and when you read the book, there's a lot of psychological issues going on. I tried to hit some of them.
Mm. Yeah, there's definitely there is a backlash. In one of our national newspapers last week, there was an article denouncing the native plant movement because they said it's not necessary from an ecological standpoint. But also beforehand, I was saying to you that I'd had some problems, and actually the issue of nationalism had been brought up with regards to native plants, and obviously that sounds as if it's something you've faced before. Can you explain a
Mm.
little bit about why people might level that charge at people who are trying to use native plants, and why you would counter, or how you would counter that?
Oh, I've been told native plant proponents are basically fascists, which which is absolutely ludicrous. I think one of the core issues is again is where I'm basically asking us to confront our privilege. That's what I mean. Gardens are like almost the ultimate form of privilege because we're not just picking what species we want to put in a space that we own, but what we're deciding where they're going to be. We're we're just continuing that hierarchy that we've always had, and that has gotten us into trouble with climate change and mass extinction right now. The idea that humans are at the top, right? So what we're doing is we're saying we need to look again at this privilege, just like we need to look more critically at white privilege or heterosexual privilege. It's the same thing when we're looking at native plants and how humans privilege themselves in the landscape and only give second bill to what certain butterfly or bee species need or what certain bird species need. So
Mm.
I really do think it's all about this idea of privilege, and we don't want to give up what we feel that are our inalienable rights to do what we want and how we want to do it.
Yeah, I think that is a big issue. So, in your opinion, how fast do we need to change our approach to gardens and the plants we use?
Oh, I'm so negative. We're screwed. It's over.
It's too late.
It
Sod it.
is.
Shall we just
I do.
plant pansies?
No, okay. Well, I don't mean it like that. I mean, if the ship is sinking, you might as well rant and yell and scream and say what you want to say, and say it with as much passion as you want to say, and who cares what other people think, because the ship is going down. It really is. So, but the least we can do is, I'm sometimes looking at my garden and think, okay, if a disease wipes out all human beings tomorrow, at least I have these native wild plants here, and they're going to slowly replicate. They're going to creep into my neighbor's yard and the landscape across the street, and maybe someday they'll recolonize, and that will be great.
Do you have problems sourcing native plants in the US, or are they quite easy?
Oh no, I've got for all of my design jobs, I have two nurseries that are regional to me. They're within just a few hours of where I live, so I'm not often getting local ecotype, which is really hard to do.
Mm.
I'm getting more things, that are basically in the same ecoregion, but my ecoregion spans such a long distance up and down the continental United States. But I'm at least within a couple of hours, and that's more than most people can get. So
Yeah, definitely. That's more than we can get, I think, where we are. We have a few nurseries, but it is slow going, to be honest. So I was reading another book, which is very popular over here, and it was put out by one of our universities with a huge landscaping department. And they were saying, we don't need to worry about natives. And so for quite a long time now, I would say over a decade, it's kind of been pumped into us as gardeners in the UK that actually it doesn't matter whether it's a native or a non-native, as long as it is providing pollen and nectar. It's all good, basically. And one of the things that they bring up is the fact that we have plants such as Mahonia that would extend the season for pollinators. So, and also we have a lot of late season perennials now. So again, extending the season further on into the year. But you actually made a really interesting point in your book about the problems with that. Can you just explain a little bit about why that might not be such a good thing?
yeah, there's 1,000 problems, and the first one, again, what you're saying, that's just another way to defend human privilege, right? But okay, so we have let's bring in exotic plants to extend the bloom season, so there's more resources for pollinators. Well, what the heck did pollinators do before we came on the scene to extend the bloom season with plants from China and Africa? They
Mm.
were just fine. That's the answer, right? So we also have lots of species. I'm thinking here native bees. There are lots of specialist native bees who are very critical to a healthy ecosystem, who evolved to use the pollen from only specific plant species, from only specific flowers from those specific plant species, and they use that pollen to feed their young. So they time their entire annual life cycle of just a few weeks to gather pollen from a certain flower from a certain plant species when it's going to be in bloom, right? And then I guess the third thing I want to say that really, really, really goes up my back, I guess, a little bit is when people are just looking at adult pollinators. So just, oh, this plant is blooming and it's being used by this butterfly, not even knowing what kind of species the butterfly is, what its life cycle is, what its preferences are. And then they're just looking at the adult, and they're just looking at the flowers. They're not even thinking that if you want to see the adult butterfly, you got to have a host plant. You have to have something where the larva, the caterpillars, can eat. And vast majority of the time, it is not an exotic plant. It has to be a native plant, because without the eggs, without the larva, you're not going to have the adult pollinator species. So what's the point?
Mm. Yeah, so I think they're happy as long as they're seeing a bunch of generalists buzzing around their garden. They think everything's fine. But again,
Absolutely.
that's
Yeah.
obviously got its problems too. Um, so the other thing that I thought I would just ask you about, because it's really interesting, because we kind of hold them up on these pedestals in the UK, and I guess you probably do in the States to a degree. But you mentioned a quote from Noel Kingsbury and Pete Udolph that states that public landscapes must be aesthetically pleasing, or the public will reject them. And I think that's a very strong kind of thing that underpins our profession of landscape architecture and garden design in this country. But you refute that. So can you explain why you don't think that is actually the case?
I don't know if I 100% refute that, do I? I mean, of course, a garden has to be beautiful to people, right? But just because it's beautiful to people doesn't mean it can't also be beautiful to other species. So that's where the frustration comes in for me. This idea that gardens are primarily places for people when they could be primarily places for hundreds and thousands of species and still be doing what we want them to do for us and for all the other species. It's not a black and white issue. It's not a this or that issue. Um, and I obviously, as I say in the book and I say in my talks, I greatly respect the things that Noel and Pete have done, but there are definitely some issues that I think are not accurate. There are times, or lots of times, when Pete says, it doesn't matter what you plant because pollinators are always going to come and use it no matter what, and that's just a load of hooey. That's not true at all.
Yeah.
And I'm okay saying that, and it's okay to say that and still respect the wonderful work that Pete's done and the way that people are moved by his gardens. Now we just need to get wildlife to be moved by them as well in some more complex ways, because I mean I don't think Pete is necessarily, I mean, he's certainly aware of ecology, it seems, but he's the plants are still arranged so that they're working for one another, not and for people, not necessarily for wildlife. So, but it's a very complex issue, and yeah.
Yeah. Yes, it is. And that's why people, I think, they look at the evolution from, say, Pete's designs, and then in the UK at the moment we have a lot of interest in wildflower meadows, which actually many of which aren't containing native species. They're just pretty flower meadows. So it's kind of, people are getting a little bit more relaxed with what they allow into the garden in terms of quote unquote weeds. So I think the whole aesthetic is moving in the right direction, but as you said, probably nowhere near quickly enough. And it is time to kind of get a bit more radical. If that's what you believe in, then, as you say, you need to kind of stand up and wave your flag and say, actually, we're not doing enough, and we're not doing it quickly enough.
And then it's okay. It's okay if people are pissed off with you. Then you just gotta let it roll off your back, because it'll happen.
Yeah.
But no, see, that's the wonderful thing about Pete's gardens. They are wilder. They're wilder looking and they're wilder functioning, and that is helping people come over. But we still have a ways to go, as you say.
Yeah, I agree. So, out of interest, I mean, what is your plant palette in your region if you're just using native plants? I mean, how big is it? Is it bigger than we might have here in the UK?
Oh God, that's a hard question too. I mean, I don't know. I have never felt constricted once by my plant palette. But that might be because I come from a tradition of writing poems. I mean, that's what my master's and PhD degree are in, and I wrote formal poetry, so I wrote sonnets and blank verse and villanelles, and once I started to write in forms that sort of constrained me and constrained my language and the specific words that I could use, I found that I was a much better writer. And I think in some ways that's how I feel with gardening and garden design. Even if I only have 50 plants to choose from, or it's more likely 100 plants I have to choose from, I feel like I'm being forced to do something really cool. And I'm certainly honoring the place I come from, because when I'm taking out a lot of yards right now. I'm taking out a lot of front yards and a lot of backyards, converting them from grass and lawn into flower meadows and design gardens. And I'm constantly thinking, how do we bring Nebraska home? and that's using these native plants. And there's so many options for shade and sun. I just feel like I have a lot. I sometimes feel like I'm overwhelmed. Maybe 50 or 100 sounds limiting, but there's so many different ways you can play with them. And then I'll walk out in a prairie or something and be like, oh my gosh, I never knew that those plants could grow together in that way. I want to try that when I'm designing my next garden. So
Mm.
there's always that wonder and excitement.
And do you deal with the hard landscaping side as well, or do you just work with plants?
No, I'm just work with plants, and that's how I like it.
Yeah, yeah, I know what you mean. So I guess what you're saying, and I'm going to put it in a slight nutshell, is you can have a successful garden design practice using just native plants, and that's what you're doing.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I'm having a great year this year. It's real things are really taking off this year. My projects are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So absolutely.
Take note and take heart. There is a place for those of us who want to garden for all species, whether we need to make a living from it or if we just want to do our part to save all life. A very big thank you to Benjamin for taking part in the interview. As with all my interviews, I make no money if you go and buy his book, but I can't recommend picking up a copy highly enough, and I've put links to it in the show notes. Thank you to you as well for listening, and if you're new to the show and enjoyed this episode, I think you'll like episodes 10 and 29 with Toby Diggins and John Little, so do go and check those out. Catch you next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.